The day had started like any other, but by the time it was over, I felt as though I'd been put through a ringer. My boss, Mr. Hamilton, was in rare form today, shouting at our team for missing another deadline. His face had gone red, veins bulging as he paced back and forth, calling us incompetent and lazy. Every word struck like a lash, biting deeper into the frustration I'd been bottling up for months. 3 years. That's how long I'd been at this job, and for 3 long years, it had drained me to the point where I barely recognized the person I used to be. I wanted to scream back at him, tell him how hard I'd been working, how I had sacrificed nights and weekends just to meet his ridiculous expectations. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. The thought of quitting was a constant whisper in my mind, growing louder every day. I couldn't remember the last time I felt even a shred of joy at this place. It was just a paycheck, a necessary evil that slowly choked the life out of me. By the time I dragged myself through the front door of our house, my nerves were frayed to the point where even the slightest noise felt like too much. I dropped my bag by the door, barely having the energy to kick off my shoes. I didn't even notice the warmth of the house or the comforting smell of dinner cooking until Emma's voice broke through my days. "Hey, love." Her cheerful greeting brought a smile to my face despite my exhaustion. Emma, my wife, my anchor. No matter how bad the day had been, coming home to her always softened the edges of my stress. She was standing in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove, her long brown hair tied up in a loose bun. Her face lit up when she saw me, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to ease. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice light and playful, as though she already knew the answer but wanted to hear me say it. I groaned, walking over to kiss her on the cheek. "Same as always." Hamilton yelled, "Deadlines missed. Everyone's on edge." She frowned slightly, but didn't press. That was the thing about Emma. She knew when to ask questions and when to let things go. We had an unspoken rhythm to our lives, a sense of understanding that had developed over the years. She turned back to the stove, stirring the sauce for what smelled like spaghetti, one of my favorites. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "Go wash up, and we'll eat." I nodded, grateful for her thoughtfulness. Every time I came home, I felt lucky to have her. She was always so positive, always there with a joke or a laugh to lift me up when I was down. I had friends who complained about their wives, about how they never stopped nagging, or how their marriages felt more like a chore than a partnership. But Emma was different. She was the kind of woman who could brighten up a room just by walking into it, and she made our house feel like a home. By the time I sat down at the table, the steaming plate of spaghetti in front of me, my muscles were already starting to relax. Emma sat across from me, smiling as she tucked into her food. We didn't talk much as we ate. Another one of those unspoken things between us. She knew I needed a little time to unwind before I could talk about the day, and I loved her for that. After we finished, I leaned back in my chair, feeling a bit more human. Emma was already up, clearing the table and humming a tune under her breath. I reached for a napkin, wiped my mouth, and then headed to the trash can to toss it away. That's when I saw it. A flash of something shiny mixed in with the usual kitchen waste. At first, I didn't register what it was. I paused, squinting at the crumpled piece of foil. A condom wrapper? My heart skipped a beat. I stared at it for a long moment, confusion fogging my already tired brain. I must have been mistaken. Maybe it was just a candy wrapper, I told myself, and the idea that it could be something else seemed absurd. Emma would never. No. I shook my head, brushing the thought aside. I was exhausted, too burned out from work to think straight. My mind was playing tricks on me, twisting something innocent into something suspicious. With a shrug, I let the wrapper fall back into the trash and closed the lid. I couldn't deal with this now. My body was screaming for sleep, and I knew tomorrow would be another uphill battle at work. The last thing I needed was to overthink something so small. "Babe, I'm heading to bed," I called out, my voice muffled as I shuffled toward the stairs. Emma appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Okay, I'll be up soon," she said, flashing me that warm, easy smile that always put me at ease. I forced a smile in return, feeling a little guilty for even having that brief, ridiculous thought about the wrapper. There was no reason to doubt her. Emma had always been loyal, always loving. I was just letting my exhaustion get the better of me. I climbed the stairs, barely making it to our bedroom before I collapsed onto the bed. I didn't even bother to change out of my work clothes. The moment my head hit the pillow, the events of the day started to fade, slipping away like sand through my fingers. Sleep was quick to pull me under, and soon I was lost to the darkness, grateful for the temporary escape from everything. But somewhere, deep in the back of my mind, the image of that shiny wrapper lingered. It hovered there, a tiny, nagging detail that refused to be forgotten, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I woke up earlier than usual, still feeling the weight of yesterday pressing down on me. My body ached from stress, but my mind was wired with the thought of leaving work early today. I had made up my mind last night. Today was going to be different. I was going to get in early, finish my tasks, and surprise Emma by coming home hours before she expected me. Normally, I didn't get home until after 8 p.m., but this time, I aimed for 5 p.m. I wanted to see the look on her face when I walked in earlier than usual, imagining her smile brightening up the room. I got dressed, grabbed my things, and was out the door just as the sun was starting to rise. The streets were quieter than usual, the calm before the rush hour madness. As I drove, I thought about how distant everything had felt lately, especially work. I hated the place more with each passing day, and the stress of it all was starting to bleed into my personal life. But not today. Today was supposed to be my reset. When I arrived at the office, it was nearly empty. A few desks were scattered with papers, and the hum of computers filled the air, but not a single colleague was in sight. I liked this feeling, being one of the first in the building. I headed straight to my desk, opened my laptop, and got to work, zoning in on my tasks like a man on a mission. Everything was moving smoothly. I ticked off each task with the kind of precision I had always prided myself on, the kind of work that made me believe I was still one of the best here. Hours passed, and I barely noticed. I was too focused on finishing early, so I could surprise Emma. I didn't stop for breaks, didn't engage in the usual office banter. Just head down, hands on the keyboard, pushing through. But then, like clockwork, the boss stormed in around midday, and his mood was no better than yesterday. You could hear him barking orders at the other teams, tearing into them for missing deadlines or failing to hit targets. His voice grated on my nerves, but I kept my head low, hoping to avoid his attention. I didn't want anything ruining my plan to leave early. Unfortunately, I wasn't that lucky. I was working on a final task when I felt his shadow loom over my desk. Without so much as a greeting, he barked, "What the hell are you doing?" I looked up confused, finishing up some of the reports from last week, just getting everything in order. He shook his head, his expression twisted in disdain. "Reports? Those reports were canceled. Why the hell are you still working on them?" I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "I wasn't told they were canceled," I replied, my voice calm, but laced with confusion. "I thought they were still due." His voice escalated, drawing the attention of the few colleagues who had trickled in by now. "Of course you weren't told. You never pay attention. I swear, for 3 years, you've done nothing but screw everything up." That sentence hit like a bullet. For 3 years, I had given this job everything I had. Late nights, weekends, stress beyond measure. And this was how I was treated? I felt my blood start to boil. His words cut deeper than he could have known. He continued ranting, his voice a crescendo of insults, tearing into every shred of self-worth I had managed to cling to. "You've always done everything wrong," he sneered. "For 3 years, you've been a screw-up. You can't do anything right." It was like a switch flipped inside me. All the frustration, all the resentment that had been building for years came roaring to the surface. Before I knew what I was doing, I stood up, my fists clenched at my sides. "Are you kidding me?" I yelled, my voice shaking with rage. "I've been busting my ass for you, working late, coming in on weekends, doing everything I can to keep this place running. And this is how you treat me? You're nothing without me, and you know it." I could see the shock on his face, and for a brief second, I thought maybe he'd back down. But he didn't. He stepped closer, his eyes blazing with anger, and before I could react, he shoved me. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to break whatever thin barrier had been holding me back. I snapped, My fist flew through the air and connected with his jaw before I even realized what I was doing. The force of it sent him stumbling back into a desk, papers flying everywhere. The office froze. No one moved, no one said a word. They were all staring at us, eyes wide with disbelief. He recovered quickly, rubbing his jaw with a sneer on his face. Without a word, he lunged at me, swinging wildly. I ducked, and for a few seconds, we were nothing more than two wild animals in a fight for dominance. I landed another punch before the other staff members rushed in to pull us apart. His face was twisted with fury, but I didn't care. I had finally said what I needed to say. As he stormed off to his office, rubbing his jaw and muttering curses under his breath, I felt a surge of satisfaction. For the first time in 3 years, I had stood up for myself. But then, as I watched him disappear down the hall, reality hit me. I had just blown up my entire career. I grabbed my things, throwing them into my bag with shaking hands. My colleagues stood around, watching, whispering amongst themselves, but I didn't care. I was done. I had no future in this place anymore, and a strange mix of freedom and dread settled in my chest. As I slung my bag over my shoulder, I grabbed a cup off my desk and hurled it at the door of his office, hearing it shatter as it hit the wood. "Go to hell!" I shouted, my voice echoing down the hallway. Then I left, slamming the door behind me. The drive home was a blur of rage and adrenaline. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I was cursing under my breath, replaying the scene over and over in my head. It wasn't just about work anymore. It was about everything. The years of being overlooked, the thankless hours, the constant pressure. It had all boiled over, and now I had nothing. I hit the gas harder, weaving through traffic without caring who saw me or if I was speeding. The thought of surprising Emma still lingered in the back of my mind, a small glimmer of hope that maybe the day could still be salvaged. I needed her calm presence, her soothing voice. But as I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. I noticed it right away, a pair of men's shoes at the entrance. They weren't mine. I frowned, my heart skipping a beat as I slammed the car door shut and walked toward the house. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe Emma had invited a friend over. Maybe, no, something wasn't right. I pushed open the front door a little too aggressively, and it slammed against the wall with a loud bang. Almost immediately, I heard footsteps upstairs, quick, panicked. Someone was running. My stomach dropped. I called out Emma's name, but my voice was sharp, filled with suspicion. "Emma!" There was no reply, just the sound of movement upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped into the hallway, glancing at the coat rack where a man's jacket hung next to Emma's. My mind started to race, connecting the dots too fast for me to stop the flood of panic. I heard her voice then, soft and shaky. "Just a minute," she called from upstairs. "Emma!" I bellowed from the bottom of the stairs, my voice cracking from a mix of fear and fury. The sound of her name echoed through the house, filling every corner with the tension that hung in the air. My heart was pounding, and my hands trembled as I waited for her to appear. The footsteps upstairs had stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was eerily silent. Then I heard her coming down, her movements hesitant, slow. When she finally appeared at the top of the stairs, I froze. Her hair was a mess, strands falling out of the loose bun she had thrown it into. Her cheeks were flushed, and her clothes were disheveled. She looked panicked, like she had been caught in the middle of something she couldn't explain. That look alone sent a surge of rage through me. I hadn't even processed the chaos that had unfolded at work earlier. The fight with my boss, the implosion of my career. But this was something far worse, something that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. Every part of me screamed that something was terribly wrong. "What's going on, Emma?" I demanded, my voice raw and sharp. "What the hell are you hiding from me?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted around, unable to meet mine. The silence stretched between us, heavy and thick. It was like she was scrambling for an excuse, something to cover the situation, but the panic on her face told me everything I needed to know. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I couldn't take it anymore. Without waiting for her to respond, I shoved past her and stormed up the stairs, heading straight for our bedroom. My footsteps echoed through the house, and I heard her call after me, "Wait, please, just wait a second." But I wasn't listening. The door to our bedroom was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the sight inside made my stomach twist. The room was a mess. Clothes were scattered all over the floor, the sheets were crumpled, and there was a palpable sense of something wrong in the air. I felt a nauseating sense of betrayal creeping up my throat. My hands shook as I scanned the room, my eyes landing on every piece of disarray. And then my gaze fell on the closet. The door was slightly open, just enough for me to see the shadows moving behind it. Without thinking, I rushed over and flung the door wide open, the wood slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. Inside, cowering and clutching at each other in fear, were two naked men. Both of them were of Asian descent, their wide, terrified eyes staring back at me as if I was some kind of beast about to tear them apart. "What the fuck?" I screamed, my voice a guttural roar that didn't even sound like my own. Rage took over, clouding my vision and turning my thoughts into static. There was no room for reason or explanation anymore. Only blind, raw fury. The two men scrambled, trying to cover themselves, their mouths moving but making no sound. I couldn't hear them over the pounding of my own heart, the rush of blood that drowned out everything else. One of them raised a hand, trying to signal for calm, his voice shaky and weak as he said, "Wait, I can explain." But I didn't care. I wasn't going to listen. Without thinking, I reached out, grabbing the closest man by the collar and yanking him forward. My fist collided with his face before I could stop myself, the sound of the impact sickening and dull. He crumpled to the floor instantly, out cold from the blow. The second man scrambled backward, raising his hands defensively. "Stop! Stop, please!" he shouted, his voice trembling. "We didn't mean any harm." I didn't give him a chance to finish. I lunged at him, fists flying, but before I could land another punch, I felt Emma pulling at my arm. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "Please stop! Don't hurt him!" I spun around, my chest heaving, and shoved her away from me. It wasn't a hard shove, but the force of my anger sent her stumbling backward, her eyes filling with tears as she collapsed to the floor, sobbing. "Please, just listen to me," she cried, her voice breaking. "I can explain. It's not what you think." But it was too late for explanations. I was beyond reason, beyond listening to anything she had to say. I turned back to the remaining man, who was now cowering in the corner, his hands still raised in a pitiful attempt to protect himself. He kept repeating the same words, "Stop, stop, stop," as if they could somehow change the outcome of what was happening. I grabbed him by the arm, yanking him to his feet. His face was pale, and he was shaking so badly he could barely stand. "What the fuck is going on?" I growled, my voice low and dangerous. "Tell me what's going on right now, or I swear, it wasn't our idea," he blurted out, his voice high-pitched with panic. "It was your wife. She invited us. We're hired, man. Just hired." I stopped, my grip on him loosening as the words sank in. "Hired?" I repeated, my mind struggling to wrap around what he was saying. He nodded frantically, his eyes darting from me to Emma, who was still sobbing on the floor. "Yeah, man. We're just, hired for sex. She paid us. We didn't mean to cause any trouble. We thought you'd be gone. She said you wouldn't be home until later." I stared at him, the full weight of his words slowly crashing down on me. Hired? Emma had hired these men? I turned to look at her, my mind spinning. She was crying uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands, but she wasn't denying it. Not once had she tried to say it wasn't true. "Don't listen to him," Emma suddenly screamed, her voice hysterical as she lifted her head, tears streaming down her face. "He's lying. He's making it sound worse than it is." I stood there, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me. My whole world had just been ripped apart, and now I didn't know what was real anymore. My wife, the woman I had trusted, loved, depended on, was sitting there, sobbing and screaming that it wasn't what I thought, while two men stood in front of me, hired to fulfill some twisted fantasy, she had kept hidden from me. "Get out," I growled, my voice barely above a whisper. The man I had been holding stumbled backward, grabbing the other man who was still unconscious on the floor. He struggled to pull him to his feet, and with some effort, managed to drag him out of the room, their naked bodies a disgusting reminder of what had just happened. I watched them leave, my mind blank with disbelief. The door slammed behind them, leaving me alone in the room with Emma. She was still on the floor, her cries reduced to soft sobs as she stared up at me, her eyes wide with fear. I stood there, seething with anger, my hands shaking at my sides. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this?" She didn't answer right away, her sobs making it hard for her to speak. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered between tears. I don't know. I didn't think it through. I was lonely. You're always at work, and Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't you dare blame this on me. Don't you dare." She broke down again, curling into herself as if she could disappear. I watched her for a moment, the woman I had loved, trusted, and given everything to, now reduced to a sobbing mess. I couldn't even look at her anymore. I turned away, walking out of the bedroom without another word, my chest tight with the overwhelming weight of betrayal. Everything I had believed in was gone, shattered in the span of a few minutes. And there was no going back. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The events of the last few minutes played on a loop in my mind, each time more gut-wrenching than the last. I could still hear the soft sobbing of Emma echoing in my ears, but it barely registered. It felt like I was trapped in some nightmare, one where nothing made sense, where everything that had been solid was now crumbling to dust around me. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I broke down. Tears streamed down my face as I sat there, my chest heaving with sobs I couldn't control. I buried my face in my hands, trying to muffle the sound, but the pain inside was too deep, too raw. I had lost control, first at work and now here in my own home. Everything was spiraling out of control, and I had no idea how to stop it. Through the haze of tears, I screamed out in agony. "Why?" My voice cracked, each word a release of the overwhelming confusion and betrayal. "Why did you do this to me, Emma?" She sat huddled on the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her face streaked with tears. She was shaking, but her eyes met mine, filled with guilt, shame, and something else I couldn't quite place. She stammered, her voice small, barely a whisper. "I wasn't getting enough from you. I needed more. You were always so tired, always so exhausted from work." I felt my stomach twist, my breath catching in my throat. She was blaming this on me? "What the hell are you talking about?" I shouted, standing up abruptly. "I work to provide for us. I came home every night to you, to this life. I've always been here for you, Emma." She wiped her nose on the back of her hand, trembling as she spoke. "I know," she whispered, "but you were so distant. Every day, you came home exhausted. I needed more than what you were giving me. I love having an active sex life. You just couldn't keep up anymore." Her words felt like ice slicing through me, cutting deep into my heart. I had always tried to do everything for her, to be enough for her. And now she was telling me that she had gone looking for that somewhere else, with someone else with two men. I stared at her, the disbelief choking me. "So, this is my fault?" I said, my voice shaking with fury. "You're saying I pushed you into this? You think that excuse is what you did?" She shook her head frantically. No, it's not your fault," she cried. "I'm not saying that. I was weak. I made a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt you. I'm sorry, I really am. Sorry." I spat, my voice rising in disbelief. "You're sorry because you got caught. You weren't sorry while they were in our bedroom. While I was working myself to death to give you everything." I couldn't look at her anymore. I felt the walls of the room closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of betrayal. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grab my coat off the chair, but I needed to get out. I needed to breathe, to think. "I can't do this right now," I muttered, shaking my head as I pulled on my coat. My vision blurred from the tears, and my mind was in a fog. All I knew was that I had to get away from her, from this house. No! Emma cried out, scrambling to her feet. She rushed toward me, grabbing at my sleeve as I headed for the door. Please don't go. We can fix this. I'll do anything. Just don't leave. I pulled my arm free from her grasp, my chest heaving with the effort of holding back the storm of emotions building inside me. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said through gritted teeth, my voice hollow. How could you do this to me? She collapsed to the floor again, sobbing, but I didn't look back. I yanked the door open and stormed out of the house, slamming it behind me. The cold night air hit my face, but it didn't calm me. I got into my car and drove, not knowing or caring where I was going. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house for 1 second longer. I turned off my phone, not wanting to see her texts or hear her voice. I didn't want to think about her, about what had happened. I needed to be alone, to let the numbness take over. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, my thoughts a tangled mess of rage, confusion, and unbearable sadness. Eventually, I found a small, cheap motel on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered dimly in the dark, a fitting reflection of how I felt inside, barely holding on, flickering on the verge of collapse. I checked in, paying with cash, not even bothering to give my name. I didn't want to exist in that moment. When I got to the room, I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed everything. Emma's tearful face, the 2 men in our closet, my boss's words from earlier that day. It all came crashing down on me at once, and I broke down again, sobbing into the pillow. My life had fallen apart in less than 24 hours. Everything I had worked for, everything I thought I knew, it was all gone. I don't know how long I cried, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by nightmares of betrayal and loss. The next day, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My body ached, and my head pounded from all the crying. I wanted to stay in that room forever, to disappear into the anonymity of that cheap motel and never face the world again. But I knew I couldn't. I had to go home. I had to face the wreckage of my life, one way or another. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed 2 cars parked outside. I didn't recognize either of them, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of confusion. Who could be here? I got out of the car and walked slowly toward the house, dread creeping up my spine. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a scene that made my heart stop. Emma was sitting on the couch, her face pale and streaked with tears. Around her sat 4 men, all of them holding batons in their hands. And standing by the door, looking as smug as ever, were the 2 Asian men from yesterday, the ones I had beaten up and thrown out of my house. Emma's eyes widened when she saw me, and she screamed, "Run! Run!" But before I could even process what was happening, one of the men grabbed me from behind, twisting my arm painfully behind my back. I struggled, but it was no use. There were too many of them. They dragged me into the living room, forcing me to my knees in front of Emma. "Is this him?" one of the men asked, turning to the 2 Asian men. They nodded, their faces bruised and swollen from the beating I had given them. "Yes, that's him," one of them said, his voice cold. "He's the one who beat us up." The leader of the group turned to me, his face twisted with anger. "Do you know what you've done?" he growled, leaning down to look me in the eye. "You beat up our models. Because of you, we're losing business. And now, you're going to pay for it." I didn't have time to react before the first blow landed. The baton came down hard on my ribs, and I let out a gasp of pain. Then came another blow, and another. I groaned, struggling to breathe, as they hit me over and over, the pain radiating through my entire body. I could hear Emma screaming, begging them to stop, but they ignored her. One of the men grabbed her, shoving a gag into her mouth to silence her cries. I thought it would never end. The beating went on for what felt like an eternity, until I was a broken, bruised mess on the floor, barely able to move. Finally, the leader stopped, breathing. "You owe us $50,000, he said, his voice calm but menacing. "If you don't get us the money in 7 days, things will get very bad for you." With that, they turned and left, dragging the 2 models with them. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving me lying on the floor, gasping for breath, while Emma sobbed uncontrollably beside me. Everything was ruined. My life was in shambles, and now I owed a debt I could never repay. And worst of all, it was all because of her. I lay there, broken, battered, and barely able to move. The sound of the front door slamming shut echoed through the house. And for a long time, the only noise was my ragged breathing and Emma's soft sobs. My entire body ached, the pain radiating from every bruise, every fractured rib, but it was nothing compared to the weight crushing my mind. My thoughts were a whirlpool of confusion, anger, and disbelief. How had my life come to this? I stared blankly at the ceiling, trying to process the beating, the threats, the humiliation. I replayed every brutal second of it in my mind, feeling the blows all over again, hearing their voices demanding $50,000, an impossible sum I could never hope to have. It felt surreal, like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. But the worst part of all wasn't the pain or the debt. It was the realization that this had all started with her. Emma. I turned my head slowly to look at her, still curled up on the floor, tears streaming down her face as she cried into her hands. I could feel the rage bubbling up inside me again, hotter and more intense than before. She was the reason I was lying here, broken and bleeding. She was the reason those men had come into our home, why I was now in a debt that could ruin both of our lives. It was all because of her. Before I knew what I was doing, I was shouting, my voice hoarse and broken. "This is all your fault." Emma flinched, looking up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I didn't know," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't think they would." "Didn't think?" I screamed, struggling to sit up, wincing as pain shot through my ribs. "You didn't think? You invited them into our home. You did this." She shook her head frantically, crawling closer to me, her hands reaching out in desperation. "Please, I didn't know this would happen. I didn't know they would." "Shut up," I bellowed, my hands gripping my head as if that could somehow block out her pathetic excuses. My entire body was trembling with fury. "This is all because of you. You ruined everything." Emma dissolved into another fit of sobs, her words barely intelligible through the tears. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I turned away from her, my fists clenched as the anger surged through me, unstoppable. I didn't care about her apologies. They meant nothing. Her tears were meaningless now. She had destroyed us. She had destroyed me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, her sobbing on the floor and me staring blankly at the wall, consumed by my own rage. Minutes, hours, time felt irrelevant in the wake of what had happened. All I knew was that the longer I sat there, the more I realized that there was no fixing this. Nothing could ever go back to the way it was. Eventually, the anger began to subside, replaced by a deep, cold sense of hopelessness. The reality of the situation began to sink in. No matter how much I screamed, no matter how much I wanted to hurt her the way she had hurt me, the fact remained. I was trapped. We were trapped. And now we owed $50,000 to a group of violent men who wouldn't hesitate to come back and finish the job if we didn't pay. Emma's voice broke through the heavy silence, soft and pleading. "What are we going to do? Where are we going to get the money?" I felt my blood boil all over again at the word we. I turned to her, my voice cold and sharp. "We? You're asking where we are going to get the money. You're the one who has to pay them. This is your fault." She recoiled as if I had slapped her, her face crumpling into more tears. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know it's my fault, but I can't do this alone. Please, I'm begging you, help me. I don't know what to do." I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get away from her, from this mess, from everything. Without a word, I pushed myself off the floor, ignoring the pain that shot through my body with every movement. I limped toward the stairs, my vision blurry from exhaustion and frustration. "I can't even look at you right now," I muttered as I passed her. "I'm going to bed." Emma reached out, grabbing my arm, her fingers trembling. "Please." I shook her off, not even glancing at her. "Don't," I said, my voice hard as steel. "Just don't." I locked myself in the bedroom, the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders as I collapsed onto the bed. My body was screaming in pain, but it was nothing compared to the agony gnawing at my heart. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Everything was spiraling out of control, and no matter what I did, I couldn't find a way out. The silence of the house was suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of Emma's muffled sobs from downstairs. I wish she would stop. I wish she would just disappear, like the woman I once thought I knew. By the time morning came, I hadn't slept a single minute. My mind had raced through every possible scenario, trying to figure out a way to come up with the money. But there was nothing. No savings, no backup plan. We had spent years building a life together, but now it all felt hollow, like it had been built on lies. When I finally came downstairs, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and swollen from crying. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with guilt and desperation. "I didn't sleep," she whispered. "I couldn't. I kept thinking. I don't have that kind of money," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "I'll sell my car." Her eyes widened, shock replacing the sadness on her face. "What? But you've been saving for 3 years for that car." "You." "Shut up," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "I know what I'm doing." Emma fell silent, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I didn't care anymore. I had stopped caring about her opinion the moment those men stormed into our home. I had to fix this, and if that meant sacrificing everything I had worked for, then so be it. For the next few days, I tried to sell the car, but no one was buying. It was a desperate move, and I knew it, but what choice did I have? Every passing hour felt like a countdown to something far worse. With 2 days left, I still hadn't found a buyer, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't going to make it. I wasn't going to come up with the money in time. So, I made a decision. I would give them the car instead. 8 days passed. 8 long, agonizing days filled with silence, dread, and the suffocating tension that hung between us. They hadn't come yet, but every tick of the clock felt like a countdown to the inevitable. I could see it in Emma's face, too. The growing anxiety in her eyes, the way she jumped at every little sound. Every time the phone rang, or a car drove by, her shoulders would tense, her breath catching in her throat as she waited for the storm to hit. But it didn't. Not yet anyway. "They're not coming," Emma said one morning, her voice thin with the hope that maybe, just maybe, we had been forgotten. Maybe they got what they wanted already. I didn't respond. I didn't want to feed her hope because deep down, I knew better. Men like that didn't just forget about money they were owed, especially not $50,000. No, this was just the calm before the inevitable. I barely looked at her when she spoke these days. The sight of her, the woman I had once loved so deeply, filled me with a mixture of sorrow and anger that I couldn't reconcile. She had ruined everything. Everything. Our perfect life, our marriage, our home. It had all been burned down by her betrayal. So I did what I could to stay out of her way. We rarely spoke, only exchanging the bare minimum needed to get through the day. I slept in the guest room, and she stayed downstairs most nights, like a stranger in her own home. She tried to talk a few times, but I had nothing left to say. Words wouldn't fix what she had broken. Then, on the 8th evening, it happened. I was standing in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, lost in the monotony of the simple task. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the soft hum of the refrigerator. I had grown used to the silence by now, welcoming it as a shield from the constant reminder of what my life had become. That's when I heard it, the low, unmistakable sound of a car pulling up outside. My heart stopped mid-beat, and I knew right away who it was. We hadn't invited anyone over. No one else knew what was going on. No one ever visited us unannounced. Not anymore. It had to be them. I stood frozen for a moment, listening to the engine turn off and the sound of car doors slamming shut. My grip tightened around the handle of the spoon, my stomach turning into a knot of dread. There was no time to think, no time to prepare. I heard their footsteps on the gravel driveway, heavy and deliberate, and then the front door flew open with a violent crack. "Where's our money?" a voice roared, filling the house with the same aggressive energy that had taken over my home just over a week ago. I turned around slowly, meeting the eyes of the man who had beaten me so mercilessly before. He was flanked by two others, their faces set in expressions of cold determination. Behind them stood the two Asian men from that night, their faces still bruised, but no less smug than they had been when they were hiding in my closet. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't have the money," I said, locking eyes with the leader. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he towered over me. "Then why the hell am I here?" he growled. "You owe us, and we're not leaving until we get what's ours." "I don't have the cash," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper, the weight of it settling heavily in my chest. "But I have the car. It's worth $56,000. Take it, and we're done." For a moment, no one spoke. The leader studied me, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of deception. He glanced at his men, then back at me, before letting out a short, humorless laugh. "The car," he repeated, shaking his head. "You think that's enough?" "It's more than enough," I said firmly. "It covers everything." He smirked, the kind of smirk that made my skin crawl. Without saying another word, he extended his hand, and I reached into my pocket, pulling out the car keys. I tossed them to him, and he caught them effortlessly, his fingers closing around the metal like it was a trophy he had won. "Well, that settles it then," he said, turning to leave. The tension in the room seemed to ease for a moment, but just as they were heading for the door, one of them paused and turned back to me. "You got a hot wife," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "I'd K her." The words were like a punch to the gut. I stood there, my fists clenched at my sides, the blood rushing to my head. Everything in me screamed to react, to lash out, but I stayed still. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. It was like I had nothing left inside to fight with. They laughed as they walked out, the door slamming behind them. I didn't react. I couldn't. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, my mind made up. I couldn't stay here anymore. The house, once filled with love and warmth, had become a prison. I couldn't look at Emma without seeing the betrayal, without feeling the rage simmering just below the surface. Every room was a reminder of what we'd lost, what she had thrown away. I packed my things quietly, stuffing clothes into a suitcase, not bothering to take much. I didn't need much. I just needed to get out. It was 6 a.m. by the time I was ready, and I called a taxi, waiting in the silence of the empty house for it to arrive. As I was about to leave, I heard soft footsteps coming from behind me. Emma stood there, her hair disheveled, her face pale. She looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation as she realized what I was doing. "You're leaving?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I just grabbed the handle of my suitcase and started walking toward the door. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't go. Don't leave me. We can fix this. We can work through it. I'll make it up to you, I promise." I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't turn to face her. "There's nothing left to fix," I said quietly, my voice hollow. "You've ruined everything." She moved closer, her hands reaching out to me, grabbing my arm as if her touch could somehow pull me back from the edge. "Please," she sobbed. "Don't do this. We can't just throw it all away." I shook her off harder this time, pushing her back. "You threw it away," I said coldly, my voice sharp. "Not me." Her sobs filled the room as I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold morning air hitting my face. The taxi was already waiting, the driver standing by the car, watching the scene unfold in silence. I didn't look back as I walked toward the car, but I could still hear Emma crying behind me, her voice growing more desperate with every step I took. When I reached the car, I threw my suitcase into the trunk and got in. The driver didn't say a word as he pulled away from the house, leaving everything behind. I watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror, the weight of it all pressing down on me, but I didn't feel regret. I felt relief. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back. I told the driver to take me to my grandmother's old house, the one that sat on the outskirts of the city. It had been years since I'd been there, but it was the only place I could think of that felt far enough away from the wreckage of my life. The only place that felt like I could start over. As we drove, the weight on my chest began to lift, little by little, with every mile that passed. The house might have been filled with memories of a life I'd lost, but the further I got from it, the closer I felt to freedom.